that morning on August 9, before Japan had time to react to the Soviet invasion, the United States dropped its second bomb, an implosive plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man, on the city of Nagasaki. Exploding ironically over the largest Catholic cathedral in Asia, with a force of 22 kilotons. 40,000 died immediately. Of them, 250 soldiers. Henry Wallace wrote of Truman and Burns in his diary on August 10th, one day after Nagasaki.
It is obvious that the attitude of Truman, Burns, and both the War and Navy departments will make for war, eventually.
Yet, neither the announcement of Nagasaki or Army Minister Anami's fallacious report that the U.S. had 100 more atomic bombs moved Tokyo any closer to surrendering unconditionally. After all, Japanese cities were being wiped out all through 1945. 200 planes and thousands of bombs, or one plane and one bomb, it didn't seem to make a noticeable difference. For Japanese leaders, the devastating news on August 9 was the Soviet invasion. Nagasaki. A top-secret study done in January 1946 by the intelligence staff of the War Department's Operations Division concludes there was little mention in the Japanese cabinet of the use of the atomic bomb by the U.S. Dropping of the bomb was the pretext seized upon as a reason for ending the war, but it is almost a certainty that the Japanese would have capitulated upon the entry of Russia into the war. Not only would the Soviets destroy their empire, but they would have no qualms about destroying the emperor himself. After all, in that spirit, 85% of the American public, convinced that the bombs had ended the war, applauded their use.
When the bomb was dropped, the war was near to ending. Anyway, was this the result of a miscalculation of the Japanese potential? Was our intelligence faulty in this area?
It was done on the theory that our troops were expecting to invade Japan in a very short time, and it was estimated that it would take about 1.5 million men to make that invasion, and in all probability there'd be 500,000 of them of casualties and 250,000 of them killed. And when we had this powerful new weapon, I had no qualms about using it, because a weapon of war is a destructive weapon. That's the reason none of us want war and all of us are against war. But when you have the weapon that'll win the war, you'd be foolish if you didn't use it.
Truman's almost 50 years later, in 1991, President George Bush praised Truman's tough, calculating decision, which spared millions of American lives. Controversy over the atomic bombings continued to roil American society. Protests by the American Legion, the Air Force Association, and congressional conservatives forced the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum to cancel a 1995 exhibit on the bombing. Young Second Lieutenant Paul Fussell, who was in the Pacific at the time of the bombing, published Thank God for the Atom Bomb in 1988, in which he wrote,
"For all the fake manliness of our facades, we cried with relief and joy. We were going to live. We were going to grow up to adulthood after all."
Like millions of others of his generation, and millions since, Fussell was convinced that Truman and the bomb saved them from invading Japan. But attributing victory to the bomb, in a sense, insults the memory of the many men and women who gave their lives to defeat the Japanese year by grinding year. Robert Oppenheimer met with Henry Wallace shortly after the war, deeply worried at the eventual slaughter of tens of millions. Earlier that year, he informed top military and civilian leaders that within 3 years, the U.S. would likely have weapons up to 7,000 times as powerful as a bomb that would destroy Hiroshima. He proposed international control of the atomic technology to assuage Soviet fears over U.S. intentions. Wallace wrote in his diary,
"The guilt consciousness of atomic scientists is one of the most astounding things I've ever seen."
He agreed with Oppenheimer. What was needed was an olive branch, and it came from the most unexpected quarter. Henry Stimson, the colonel, was a true old soldier, but he was terrified by the forces he'd helped unleash, and now wanted to put the genie back in the bottle. In early September, Stimson sent a memo to Truman saying that the Soviets should be treated as allies.
If we have this weapon rather ostentatiously on our hip, their suspicions and their distrust of our purposes and motives will increase. The chief lesson that I have learned in a long life is that the only way you can make a man trustworthy is to trust him. And the surest way to make him untrustworthy is to distrust him and show your distrust.
He proposed that the U.S. dismantle its atomic bombs if the Soviets agreed that both countries would ban atomic weapons research, and thus submit to an international system of control. Truman devoted the historic September 21, 1945 cabinet meeting, Stimson's last, to discuss his proposal. Wallace allied himself with Stimson, indicating the absurdity of trying to keep an atomic monopoly.
I then went at some length into the whole scientific background, describing how foreign Jewish scientists had, in the first place, sold the President in the fall of 1939. I indicated the degree to which the whole approach had originated in Europe, and that it was impossible to bottle the thing up, no matter how much we tried.
With Burns away in London, Navy Secretary James Forrestal argued that the Soviets could not be trusted. The Russians, he said, like the Japanese, are essentially Oriental in their thinking. The cabinet split sharply over Stimson's proposal, which would have put the United States squarely on the side of wanting world peace. But Truman vacillated and ultimately yielded to the Burns-Forrestal hardline faction. The fear and potentially suicidal arms race would continue. When Truman finally met with Robert Oppenheimer in October 1945, he asked him to guess when the Russians would develop their own atomic bomb. Oppenheimer did not know. Truman responded that he knew the answer. Never. Clearly surprised by the president's truculent ignorance and frustrated that he did not understand the seriousness of the evolving crisis, Oppenheimer blurted out, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman responded with anger.
I told him the blood was on my hands and to let me worry about that.
Afterwards, Truman told Dean Acheson,
I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again.
Oppenheimer was later attacked by right-wing conservatives as an agent of the Soviet Union and subjected to numerous investigations by the FBI. In 1954, his security clearance was revoked. His real crime, in the eyes of American authorities, was opposing building the new hydrogen bomb, which he considered a weapon of genocide. Contrary to the belief of Truman's inner circle, the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not make the Soviet Union any more pliable. Soviet forces occupied the northern half of the Korean peninsula, left face-to-face with U.S. forces in the south. Korea would later become a major flashpoint in the Cold War that would engulf the world for another 50 years. But on a far larger scale, the bombing haunted the Soviet imagination. Future Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko's son, Anatoly, recalled his father telling him that Hiroshima set the heads of the Soviet military spinning. The mood in the Kremlin was neurotic. The mistrust towards the Allies grew quickly. Opinions floated around to preserve a large land army to establish control over extended territories to lessen potential losses from another atomic bombing. And in what many consider a cruel irony, the Japanese were allowed, after all, to keep the emperor, whose retention most experts believed essential to post-war stability in Japan. Truman suffered no political repercussions from this decision.
How did you manage it? How did you keep your equilibrium? How did you sleep at night?
I have no trouble sleeping at night. All my life, whenever it comes time to make a decision, I make it. And forget about it and go to work on something else.
Do you have any reason to think in historical terms that this new and terrible hydrogen weapon will not be used?
I hope it will never have to be used because I hope we'll keep the peace in the world. It won't be necessary. If the world ever gets into turmoil, however, it will be used. You can be sure of that.
For aggression by the Soviet Union. When we examined it in detail, the United States is far more aggressive after World War II than the Soviets were. The Soviets were somewhat terrified of us. We dropped the bomb on Japan, not against Japan, but against the Soviet Union, to make a very important point. This is a tragic mistake. The United States found itself on the side of the aggressor. Ironic because World War II left as many as 70 million people dead in Europe and Asia, 2/3 of them civilians. Hiroshima was an ominous forewarning. The Depression was perhaps over, but America's business and social planners feared a relapse of the post-war era. In mid-September 1945, at a foreign ministers' meeting in London, Secretary of State Jimmy Burns berated Soviet policies in Eastern Europe. Foreign Minister Molotov pointed to exclusionary U.S. policies in Italy, Greece, and Japan, and, tired of Burns' belligerence, asked if he was hiding an atomic bomb in his pocket. Burns actually replied,
You don't know Southern. We carry our artillery in our pocket. If you don't cut out all this stalling, I'm going to pull an atomic bomb out of my pocket and let you have it.
In December, Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace pressed Truman to take control of America's atomic weapons away from Soviet hater Leslie Groves, who still had unilateral control over them. Groves had advocated a preemptive attack against any potential rival trying to make or possess atomic weapons. The Soviet Union, with the largest army in the world and having played the leading role in the anti-fascist movement, was now a frightening prospect for some U.S. officials.